If you do your Ancestry.com or whatever site they do these things, and if you go back, they say, if you go back too far, you'll probably find a horse thief somewhere. And we always like to kind of put the best shine on things. If we find our grandfather, great grandfather was some distinguished person, we love to highlight that very much, even though his father's father was, a criminal or some kind of blot. But we obviously put it that. But when you go through the ancestry of Jesus Christ, they don't hide it, and it's a remarkable part of the Bible. Like it starts off in Matthew, Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham. And Abraham, of course, the heroic father of our faith, but he had a lapse in his faith. He had a lapse in his faith twice. He repeated it when he denied that Sarah was his wife, putting her virtue in jeopardy, and did it to protect his own skin. And he did it twice. One of the reasons was maybe he shouldn't have gone to Egypt in the difficult time, but he went and found himself in trouble. I heard there in the week, like the armor of God, and one of the Bible college students was saying that one of them is the gospel boots of peace. That actually we think when we are out sharing the gospel that is a time when we are really under spiritual warfare, but actually that is a time when we find more safety. That is when David didn't go into the warfare when they were fighting the battle. Instead, he stayed home and fell into temptation with Bathsheba and really caused great devastation in his life. He watched Bathsheba, he saw her bathing, he called her over because he's the king, he can do what he wants. He brought her over, and then, he had relations with her and she became pregnant. And then to cover it up, he had her husband Uriah, who was out fighting the battle, doing what David himself should have been doing. And he brought him in and said to Uriah, go on home, be with your wife. He was going to cover up his sin by that if Uriah went home to be with his wife, and then when the child was found, they would think it was him and his own child. But Uriah says, how can I go back and fight? Go back and be at home with my wife when the men are out fighting in the battlefield, sleeping in tents. I won't do it. And he slept, I think, outside the gate of the palace. And what a rebuke to David. It's exactly where David should have been. But Abraham, as we said, had a lapse of faith. David also had this lapse of faith. And yet he is called, as you open the Gospel, the New Testament, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And then you go on down into the genealogy. I think, there's generations and generations, over 40 generations it goes down to. And then Luke goes all the way back to Adam. And all these generations, that showing that not only was Jesus a man born of Mary, but that his descendants were people. He was fully man, except without sin. But you go other, and I think we mentioned this before, like in his genealogy, as many others didn't have such a illustrious past. Solomon had his great sins, but it particularly mentions 4 women, which is of unusual because normally you don't mention the women in the genealogy. And it says David and Solomon, the son of David, of her who was the wife of Uriah, really marking this point. And it shows the grace of God on on David, because he forgave David, though he had to live with the consequences of the sin. He forgave him, and they both repented. And Bathsheba and David had a son, Solomon. And of all the sons David had, Solomon was chosen to be the king, Bathsheba's son to be the king. And then we read of Ruth, a Moabitess, and although it's argued, there is this, whether it only applies to the male, it says that no Moabitess is to be allowed into the congregation, but Ruth is brought in. And Ruth is, as a funny little aside on this, Ruth is a Moabitess. The Moabites come from Lot. Lot came out of Sodom and Gomorrah, and his daughters came out, and the mother of the Moab, Lot's wife, she looked back and turned back and was turned into the pillar of salt. But Ruth would not look back. She went forward, and she went all the way forward, this Moabitess, and as a result, she became the descendant of David. And then the other two, and we'll just finish with this. Tamar, I think we mentioned before. Tamar was that son of the daughter-in-law of Judah, and she became the descendant. We went into that before. I can't say much about it, but maybe we'll just mention Rahab, who had been a prostitute in the city of Jericho and a non-Jewish person, and she believed in the God of Israel, and she put her faith in the God of Israel and became a believer, and left that life and was married into the lineage of David. And you see these wonderful things. Why? Because it teaches us that this gospel is the gospel of grace. This house of Jesus Christ is a house of mercy. This is a house for all nations, whether Ruth, who was a Moabitess, or Rahab, who was from Jericho, and their backgrounds, Bathsheba and Tamar, their backgrounds that had things that were questionable in it. Yet he is not ashamed to call his brethren. And this is the lineage of Jesus Christ. These are his people. We are his people. And this is the house of God. It is a broad house. It is a wide house. It is a house of mercy. It is a house of grace. And it is a house for all nations. So we thank God for that. And this is why joy to the world. The Lord has come. Peace and goodwill to all men. And we thank God for this. Amen. Amen.